The code compiled successfully, but no one stopped to ask what happens when it runs. Imagine a system adjusting what you see when you see it and how long you remain engaged while its objective stays outside your awareness. The consent problem is not optimization by itself. It begins when a system pursues a goal involving your attention or behavior without giving you meaningful understanding or choice. That boundary remains connected to consequences. A service may offer genuine value while also steering engagement. The ethical question is whether participation in the service counts as consent to the full range of optimization surrounding it. That contrast remains bounded by purpose. Consent becomes thin when agreement is broad, the objective is obscure, and refusal requires abandoning something important. Technical success is not moral permission. That asymmetry remains linked to authority when the result begins to shape opportunity. This episode asks what meaningful consent would require when optimization is continuous, personalized, and difficult for the affected person to observe. That handoff remains important to affected people where power and exposure are distributed unevenly. To answer, we must distinguish permission, awareness, comprehension, voluntariness, and contestability. A single act of acceptance may not satisfy those 5 conditions. That condition remains limited by practical conditions while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. Suppose a platform arranges options to encourage longer engagement. The arrangement may be convenient, entertaining, or useful, yet it still influences what becomes salient. That choice remains worthy of explicit scrutiny. The user may know that some form of personalization occurs without knowing which objective guides it, which signals matter, or what trade-offs are being made. That tension remains open to review. Now, awareness of influence is not the same as consent to a specific optimization target. Knowing that selection occurs does not reveal what the selection pursues. That limitation remains subject to justification. Consent requires an object. A person must be consenting to something sufficiently defined. Vague participation cannot automatically authorize the full range of possible uses of attention or data. That priority remains contestable in practice. The stakes concern autonomy. Autonomy is not freedom from influence altogether, it is the capacity to act through reasons and choices one can meaningfully recognize as one's own. That relationship remains part of the design. Hidden optimization may weaken that capacity by shaping the environment while keeping the shaping process difficult to inspect or challenge. That safeguard remains inseparable from institutional choice as long as the surrounding trade-off is acknowledged. Meaningful consent usually involves more than disclosure. Information must be understandable, relevant, timely, and connected to a realistic ability to choose differently. That responsibility remains open to revision because technical precision cannot settle moral priority. The distinction matters. A dense explanation can technically reveal a practice while leaving the person unable to understand its practical effect. That agency remains central to the moral inquiry when the result begins to shape opportunity. Voluntariness also matters. A choice may be formally optional while the cost of refusal is so high that the option carries little practical freedom. That authority remains within human responsibility. Consent therefore depends on surrounding conditions. Access, dependency, alternatives, urgency, and bargaining power can change what an apparent agreement morally means. That consent remains visible during deployment, while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. A second distinction separates consent to a service from consent to a method. Wanting recommendations does not necessarily mean accepting each technique used to maximize engagement. That fairness remains dependent on context. A third separates consent to a goal from consent to its intensity. A person may welcome helpful reminders while rejecting relentless pressure toward the same outcome. That justification remains unsettled by technical performance. Different ethical frameworks emphasize different concerns. A rights-based view protects boundaries while a consequence-focused view compares benefits and harms across affected people. That oversight remains necessary for accountable judgment without pretending that one framework resolves competing conflicts. A dignity-centered view asks whether the person is treated as an agent capable of reasons or merely as a variable to be optimized. that contestability remains tied to real burdens. The core mechanism begins with objective opacity. The system has a target, but the affected person may see only the interface or outcome rather than the target itself. That purpose remains ethically relevant. Opacity creates asymmetry. The operator can observe responses and refine influence, while the user may not know which behavior is being encouraged or why. That burden remains connected to consequences. Next comes adaptive pressure. Because the system can adjust repeatedly, the terms of influence may change after the person's initial agreement. That trade-off remains bounded by purpose because technical precision cannot settle moral priority. A one-time choice can therefore become outdated. Consent given under one set of expectations may not cover materially different methods or objectives later. That assumption remains linked to authority when the result begins to shape opportunity. Then comes friction asymmetry. Continuing is easy, while inspecting settings, reducing personalization, or leaving the service may require extra effort. That decision remains important to affected people where power and exposure are distributed unevenly. That asymmetry does not prove coercion, but it can make formal choice less meaningful by placing the burden of resistance on the less informed party. That framework remains limited by practical conditions. Pause and examine the trade-off. Personalization can reduce irrelevant options and improve convenience, yet the same adaptiveness can make influence harder to perceive. That constraint remains worthy of explicit scrutiny. Another mechanism is goal substitution. A service may begin by supporting a user's purpose, then gradually prioritize the operator's engagement objective over that purpose. That incentive remains open to review. The ethical concern is not that interests must align perfectly. It is whether the divergence is visible and whether the user retains meaningful control. That interpretation remains subject to justification. Consent weakens further when the system learns from hesitation, fatigue, or impulsive response while the person cannot inspect how those states affect selection. That allocation remains contestable in practice, especially where affected people cannot easily object. We built the mirror. Optimization can reflect preferences, but it can also reinforce whichever responses are easiest to elicit under the current design. That process remains part of the design. That creates a loop. The system treats observed behavior as preference, then shapes the environment to produce more of the same behavior. That metric remains inseparable from institutional choice as long as the surrounding trade-off is acknowledged. Observed action and autonomous endorsement are not identical. A click, pause, or purchase can occur without representing a considered long-term preference. That objective remains open to revision because technical precision cannot settle moral priority. Therefore, design should not treat each measurable response as unrestricted permission to intensify the condition that produced it. That exception remains central to the moral inquiry when the result begins to shape opportunity. A stronger consent model would separate service participation from optional optimization layers and explain the practical purpose of each layer. That uncertainty remains within human responsibility where power and exposure are distributed unevenly. A reasonable counterpoint is that complete explanation may be impossible. Complex adaptive systems cannot be summarized without losing technical detail. That benefit remains visible during deployment, while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. That limitation matters, but meaningful consent does not require exhaustive engineering knowledge. It requires enough information to understand purpose, consequence, and available choice. That risk remains dependent on context before convenience hardens into unquestioned authority. Another counterpoint is that users may genuinely prefer strong personalization and may accept influence in exchange for convenience or relevance. That permission remains unsettled by technical performance once the process carries practical consequences. Of course, that preference deserves respect. The ethical issue is whether the choice is informed and revisable rather than assumed from continued use. That review remains necessary for accountable judgment. A legitimate benefit appears when optimization clearly serves the user's stated objective, stays within expected boundaries, and allows practical adjustment. That appeal remains tied to real burdens, especially where affected people cannot easily object. Even then, consent may need renewal. Material changes in objective, data use, or intensity may require renewed explanation and renewed choice. That governance remains ethically relevant rather than disappearing behind the output. A further boundary concerns collective effects. Individual consent may not settle impacts on people who did not agree but are affected by the system's broader operation. That accountability remains connected to consequences. The opening question can now be answered. Open optimization and hidden optimization differ because transparency and choice change the person's status within the process. That autonomy remains bounded by purpose. Open influence can still be manipulative or unfair, but it gives the person a better chance to understand, contest, and redirect what is happening. That dignity remains linked to authority. Hidden influence treats adaptation as an operator's private advantage. The person becomes an object of experimentation rather than a participant in a shared arrangement. That power remains important to affected people. Meaningful consent requires a comprehensible purpose, proportionate methods, realistic alternatives, and a continuing ability to revise or withdraw permission. That context remains limited by practical conditions, while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. It also requires limits. Consent to one function should not silently expand into permission for unrelated goals simply because the technology makes expansion possible. That deployment remains worthy of explicit scrutiny. And yet withdrawal must be practical. A theoretical control has little moral value when using it is confusing, punitive, or disconnected from the actual optimization. That evaluation remains open to review. Contestability matters because consent can fail. A person should be able to question an outcome, correct relevant assumptions, and reach someone able to change the process. That consequence remains subject to justification. Designers should also distinguish immediate behavior from reflective preference. Optimization that captures attention may conflict with what the person would choose after deliberation. That standard remains contestable in practice, especially where affected people cannot easily object. The practical goal is not an influence-free environment. Such an environment is unrealistic. The goal is influence that remains visible, bounded, and answerable. That criterion remains part of the design. Begin by asking which objective is being optimized. Engagement, completion, safety, convenience, spending, and retention create different ethical relationships. That threshold remains inseparable from institutional choice as long as the surrounding trade-off is acknowledged. Then ask whether the person can understand that objective before its consequences become difficult to reverse or avoid. That distribution remains open to revision because technical precision cannot settle moral priority. Examine the alternatives. Can someone decline the optimization while retaining the core service, or does refusal require total exit? That procedure remains central to the moral inquiry when the result begins to shape opportunity. Check whether the choice remains revisable. Settings, explanations, and appeal paths should remain accessible after the initial moment of agreement. That capacity remains within human responsibility, where power and exposure are distributed unevenly. Identify who benefits from greater optimization and who carries the cost when the objective conflicts with the person's longer-term interests. That role remains visible during deployment, while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. Compare the arrangement under autonomy, dignity, consequence, and fairness frameworks. Each reveals a different weakness in purely procedural consent. That transfer remains dependent on context before convenience hardens into unquestioned authority. Finally, ask whether the system supports the user's purpose or quietly replaces it with the operator's preferred metric. That result remains unsettled by technical performance once the process carries practical consequences. Not can we, but should we. Optimization becomes more defensible when the people affected can understand its purpose, limit its reach, and meaningfully refuse. That method remains necessary for accountable judgment. Consent is not a decorative checkpoint. It is an ongoing relationship between power, information, and choice. That arrangement remains tied to real burdens. The machine is learning. The question is, what are we teaching it?